commune, koinonein, with becoming with the body through sensing. While we commune with genuine beinghood, prostein ontos ousion, with the soul through reasoning. Rather than clarify how we commune with reality via the soul and its reasoning capacity, however, the stranger turns instead to consider the ways in which the various realities come into communion with each other. The lack of a discussion of how the soul comes into communion with reality is made all the more conspicuous by the dialogue's connection to the Parmenides, a dialogue which problematizes our capacity for coming into any kind of communion or contact with genuine beinghood. If, as the Parmenides argues, Socrates' forms are truly separate from their instances, we will have no knowledge of them, and they will have no relation to us. Communion would seem impossible. I argue instead that the Phaedrus provides an account of the soul's communion with reality, and thereby supplies a resolution to the lacuna in the sophist and meets Parmenides' challenge head-on. In the Palinodes myth, Socrates depicts the soul as a winged charioteer with a team of horses that is able to follow the gods, when well ordered, up to a place beyond the heavens, to see and feast upon the genuine beings, ta ontos anta. And ultimately with this strange phrase, beinghood, beingly being, ousia ontos ousa. In addition to mythically depicting the soul's communion with reality, the Palinode also discloses the anthropological and metaphysical conditions under which the soul can come into such communion. The soul must be well ordered, that is, the soul's charioteer must train the soul's horses so that the whole soul can move harmoniously toward the object of its desire. And the soul must be receptive to the activity of something higher than itself, whereby it is elevated beyond its mere capacities. That is, the soul must have followed the gods to the superheavenly realities, while disembodied, and while embodied, the soul must be rejuvenated by its experience of erotic madness, a divine gift. Since we cannot make the ascent to the superheavenly realities without some kind of assistance, communion with reality will only be possible for us if reality itself is the kind of thing that can in some sense meet us where we are and draw us back up to it. So in the interest of time, I restrict my focus to beauty's role in the soul's communion with reality. I argue that beauty, a superheavenly reality given prominent place in the Phaedrus' metaphysical vision, descends to us and invites us into communion with itself through its radiant images, whereby we can be drawn back up to it. By casting forth radiant images of itself, beauty also inspires the gods to descend to us to assist us in ascending by caring for us and leading us to the superheavenly place. By doing so, beauty meets us where we are in our average everyday way, which is insufficiently attuned to the true beings. And beauty breaks through this everydayness to turn us around and lead us up into communion with itself. So as we know, for Plato, the world seems to be made up of immaterial and intelligible forms and phenomenal material images of those forms. Before coming into this incarnate life, as the Phaedrus' myth tells us, we follow the gods to some place out beyond the heavens and saw the genuine beings there. We were able to follow the gods because our souls were once winged. As Socrates explains, the wing's natural capacity is to lead upward what is weighty to the place where the gods dwell. The wing, more than any other bodily part, communes, koinōnti, with the divine, which is beautiful, wise, good, and everything of this sort. As Socrates says, the soul's feathers are especially nourished and increased by these, but diminished and utterly destroyed by shame, vice, and such opposites. All those who have come into human form do so after losing their soul's feathers, subsequently being carried down until they settle into individual bodies. Falling to earth, we no longer have immediate access to the forms, though we retain them in memory in proportion to the adequacy with which we beheld them while following the gods. Embodied human souls, cut off and alienated from the forms by which they are nourished and fulfilled, must make their way through the world of their phenomenal experience. The rational and directive parts of our soul, like a charioteer, must rein in and order the soul's equine motive forces, desire for pleasure, socially conscious restraint. But since the charioteer is undernourished, given that it has lost access to the food proper to it, we are liable to be in a condition in which chariot driving is difficult and irksome for us. In this case, one or the other of the soul's horses tends to get the upper hand, especially since their nourishment does not directly depend on contact with the forms. Images of the forms that we now struggle to recall structure our phenomenal experience. Our difficulty recalling the forms themselves prevents us from adequately navigating our phenomenal experience. This difficulty is magnified to the extent that, as Socrates says, we had bad luck when falling here, and were turned toward injustice by some company or other, and thus forgot the sacred things we had previously seen. Even those luckier souls who are blessed with sufficient memory of the genuine beings are thoroughly startled and do not recognize the sensation that they are having when they see earthly images of the forms, for they cannot sufficiently see the form through their earthly images. Since most images of the superheavenly forms have no shine, as Socrates claims, we can only approach these images and behold the original of the thing imaged with difficulty. If we have become corrupt, this difficulty is increased, and we will fail to be conveyed quickly to the form from the earthly image and namesake upon which we are looking. When we navigate the world in our average everyday way, we do so by attending to images of the true beings, which we, in our lack of understanding, are prone to take as true beings themselves, rather than as images thereof. Depending on what's directive in the soul, we'll either prudishly hold back from the images of our experience, and thus fail to see through them to that which they image, when the white horse reigns, or rapaciously try to mount and consume them like a wolf unto the lamb, with the same result if the black horse reigns. Images are what they are by presenting what they image in a new mode, as when the intelligible content of a reality is present perceptually in an image of that reality. Phenomenal beings, which are images of the realities beyond the heavens, are what they are, and are at all, by virtue of their participation in the superheavenly realities, which the phenomenal beings themselves present perceptually. Because every image presents the reality it images, each image is a locus that provides us a mediated contact with the reality imaged. In this way, we can think of images as invitations to communion with the genuine beings. They present a foretaste of contact with the realities to be known at the summit of the divine ascent in a mode more accessible to us through perception. In doing so, images can awaken our desire to come into communion with the true beings. The things of our experience can't reveal themselves to us for what they are unless we see them as images pointing towards that of which they are images. Likewise, the prisoner in the cave, we recall, only sees the shadows as shadows once she turns around and looks at that which casts the shadows. Responding to reality's invitation requires recognizing the image character of the things of our experience and tracing those images back to their sources. This, as we've said, is difficult for us to the extent that we are not internally harmonized and are thereby unable to view images from the right perspective. Reality, however, possesses a way of breaking through our everyday ensnarement in deficient understandings of the images of our experience, and that is the brilliance of beauty. We see this in-breaking aspect of beauty, both in its characterization and in its effects. Beauty, unlike the other lovely forms, is, as Socrates says, naturally the most clearly visible and the most lovely. Images of the other forms have no shine on earth, and consequently tend to fail to enrapture those who see them, with the result that those who are not yet enraptured fail to recognize that the images are in fact images. But beauty presents itself immediately to the eye, in and through its earthly images. Whereas ordinary images tend to arrest our gaze insofar as they fail to point beyond themselves to that which they image, images of beauty tend to arrest our gaze in a wholly different sense. They won't allow us to look away without seeing something of beauty in them, proportionately perhaps to the state of our internal harmonization. As we continue to look at images of beauty, the soul is, as Socrates says, warmed by beauty's invading drafts. As a result, the soul begins to heal and regrow its wings so that it can be led back up to the superheavenly realities. Beauty flashes forth like a lightning bolt in the beautiful image and carries our thought back in memory towards the essence of the beautiful so that we can see it once again. In doing so, beauty inspires fear and reverence in the beholder, such that the viewer is drawn into the tension of a contradictory pair of motions. She is simultaneously pulled toward the beautiful as an object of desire, and yet holds herself back from the beautiful as an object of reverence. The soul in whom beauty has inspired fear and reverence is simultaneously unwilling to be deprived of beauty and unwilling to trample over what's beautiful in rapacious desire. By holding us in this tense suspension, beauty opens a new possibility for the soul who remains internally divided and not yet harmonized under the charioteer's direction. In the seditious soul, the motive forces, especially want and desire for pleasure, rebel against reason's direction and against each other. Consequently, such a soul posits for itself contradictory aims, and, like Phaedrus, bifurcates itself by going in two different directions. Beauty mediates this disagreement by showing the soul, as if for the first time, that each of the soul's ends are achievable. We can genuinely enjoy the pleasure that attends beauty, what the black horse seeks, and genuinely respect the beautiful beloved's well-being, what the white horse seeks. But we can only do so if neither drive is directive for the soul, since they pull in opposite directions. Both goals can be achieved only in the pursuit of a third goal, the recognition of beauty itself, and living a life structured by this recognition, which is what the charioteer seeks. Beauty thus makes a claim on the soul. This is how reality is, and this is how you ought to be in response. In the experience of beauty, we can no longer be indifferent, but must choose how we'll respond. The dialogue subtly prepares us for the way in which beauty breaks in, and thereby invites us into the gods' cosmic dance, by situating all but its first three Stephanus pages under the shaded bower to which Socrates refers using the rare word katagoge and its lexical neighbor katagogion. Neither of these words occur elsewhere within the Platonic corpus. Katagoge's sole appearance occurs within a cluster of 10 etymologically related terms, agane compounds, what, for lack of a better term, we might call agogic terms, leading terms. Within the 4 Stephanus pages of the dialogue's prologue, we see these first 10 agane compounds show up. Through this verbal texturing, Socrates calls attention to katagoge's roots, kata plus agane. While the colloquial translation of katagoge as resting place is suitable in context, given the unparalleled frequency of agogic terms in the Phaedrus, we ought to consider its etymology and translate more literally, so that neither its connection with other agogic or leading language, nor its particular strangeness in the dialogue are obscured. Why would Plato choose this word, and why would he situate it among so many closely related words? Given the dialogue's abundance of agogic terms, which take on critical roles throughout the dialogue, culminating in soul leading, sukagogia, near the dialogue's end, we should recognize that the choice of the rare word is not neutral. That Plato uses a word with a direct etymological connection to the crucial term soul leading, instead of some ordinary or even poetic term without such a connection, is significant. But if the leading relation requires a leader, a follower, a whence, a whither, and perhaps a for the sake of which, then Plato's use of a leading term here invites speculation about how these different elements are relevant to katagoge. The locative aspects are already given some sense by kata, downward, and so we know that the grove, whatever else it is, has some connection to something above it, from which comes whatever is being led. The Palanos myth fills in this spatial metaphor by depicting Zeus leading an army of gods, daimonia, and human souls to a place beyond the heavens. We are retrospectively invited to see whatever is being led to the katagoge as being led from the superheavenly place, from really real reality itself, back down to earth, the place of our phenomenal experience. Socrates' frequent references to being possessed by various local deities during his first speech suggest that the grove, whatever else it is a meeting place of the divine and the mundane. Given that the gods are later depicted as leading human beings, we might think that the katagoge is likewise a place at which the gods can meet human beings and thus begin to lead them. Doubtless this is true, but if that's the whole explanation, we should be puzzled by the fact that it is a katagoge rather than an anagogion, since the gods will, in the Palinode at least, be leading human souls up, ana, rather than down, kata. So no immediate parallel in the imagery or content of the Phaedrus for something leading something else downward suggests itself, and so the puzzle remains unless we can find a reasonable sense for why Plato sets the dialogue within the leading down place. I suggest that we reinterpret katagoge from the perspective of the metaphysics of beauty and images. We thereby get a more sensible root understanding at work in the seemingly innocuous term, another way by which the prologue foreshadows later themes, and a positive account of why the gods would descend in the first place. The katagoge, the leading down place, is indeed the place where the divine breaks in most directly, and on account of this inbreaking, it is a place where we can encounter the gods and thus begin to follow them wherever they lead. But more fundamentally, the Katagoge is the place to which the gods have themselves been led. Beauty itself leads the gods down to the grove by means of its radiant images, to this beautiful place, itself a radiant image of beauty. In what sense can we say that beauty leads the gods by means of those radiant images? Because the gods are perfectly oriented to what's good, true, and beautiful, they are always in right relation to what's good, true, and beautiful. We could say that they've made these arch structures of reality the gravitational center of their existence. Being in right relation to the beautiful is to love the beautiful as some primary, inexhaustible value to be valued for its own sake. To be in right relation to the beautiful is to recognize it for what it is and love it accordingly. As Diodama claims in the Symposium, one who has been tutored in love matters and beholds beautiful things in order and correctly, or who is led, Augustai, there by another, will be drawn to beauty itself, what we might call absolute beauty. One doesn't engage with beauty rightly unless by coming to beauty itself, and since the gods do engage rightly, they are so drawn. Unlike human souls, gods don't need to learn how to love things in proper order, for they are already rightly attuned. The gods' perpetual nearness to these arch structures of reality is what makes them divine, as 246e implies. They are divine by being attuned to and near what's divine. By implication, we can say that only the super-heavenly beings are divine per se, whereas the gods are divine analogously, by a perfect participation. The gods are thus models for our own relation to beauty. While we will never have an orientation towards beauty that is free of fragility, and the possibility of falling away, we can, like the gods, be properly oriented, though our mode of doing so will require constant renewing of our commitments. By giving us the gift of divine mania and leading us in the ascent, the gods can mediate our orientation toward and return to what is ultimate. But what does it mean to come to beauty itself? If the relationship between beauty and the various beauties is one of participation, wherein each participating beauty shares with, metexis, beauty itself, beauty's own character, then each of the relative beauties has a share of beauty itself. While beauty is irreducible to any, or even the sum of its participants, it is nevertheless present as a whole in each of the participants, like a day which, although one and the same, is many places at once and is not at all separate from itself, as Socrates says in the Parmenides. The gods, in their perfect orientation to beauty, love the whole of beauty. Since the participant beauties partake of beauty, the gods must also love those relative beauties in order to love the whole of beauty as a whole. For beauty is present to, parousia, and communes with, koinonia, the relative beauties, as Phaedo 100d tells us. The fact that the gods' love of beauty entails loving the beautiful images to which beauty is present supplies an answer to a further puzzling question. If the gods are perfectly ordered to reality and can make the ascent with ease, why would they descend in the first place? We might think that they do so for a humanitarian aid mission, and doubtless they do, since the gods' care for all implies as much. Recall that every soul takes care of everything which is soulless, and that the great leader in heaven, Zeus, takes the lead, arranging everything thoroughly and taking care of it. But this answer doesn't explain why the gods take care of things beneath them. It merely describes their habitual way of acting. We might also think that though the gods are perfectly oriented, they are still somehow incomplete and thus cannot exist simply as form. When Socrates says, all souls, every one of them, leave the sight of being unfulfilled, the all souls, I submit, refers not only to all human souls, nor even all mortal souls, but to all souls simpliciter, thus including divine souls. One might argue that the palinode includes divine souls to indicate the ontological distinction between the forms, which are truly divine and at home in the super-heavenly place, and everything else that exists, which is ontologically dependent on the forms and the things in the super-heavenly place. Accordingly, human souls are distinguished from divine souls by degree of perfection rather than in kind. We might say the gods are perfect in their perfect orientation of truth, whereas human souls are contingently perfectible, insofar as they can continually commit and recommit to truth. But even in their perfection, the gods cannot remain in the super-heavenly place as if they were forms. Unlike the prior answer, this answer to the question of why the gods descend suffices to explain why they don't remain above the heavens, that is, due to their inability to persistently live in a super-heavenly mode. But it doesn't tell us why they habitually act with care. So why characterize the gods' descent as motivated by care if the real reason the gods can't remain in the superheavenly place is an incompleteness which causes them to fall away? Rather, a more satisfying answer is that the gods descend out of love for the beautiful. The gods' action is their own, that is, they choose to go back down rather than fall due to incapacity, and their own desire motivates them. That is, the gods want to go down in order to most completely commune with beauty, which has always already dispersed itself below the superheavenly region. If loving absolute beauty entails loving relative beauties, then we have good reason to reinterpret Socrates' noteworthy remark that all souls, every one of them, leave the sight of being unfulfilled. We have another more profound reason than inadequacy to recognize why even divine souls leave the superheavenly place unfulfilled. Namely, beauty itself is not confined to the superheavenly place, but instead has diffused itself throughout the cosmos in its radiant images. Accordingly, any soul that sought to see beauty itself simply would be unfulfilled, for beauty is never simply itself, but always also in others. The gods leave the sight of beauty to continue seeing beauty in all of its self-diffusion, for beauty is always out beyond itself, giving itself over to what's other in its radiant images, just as the sun gives itself over to what's other in its rays. This is why later on, Socrates can say confidently in response to Phaedrus' worry about the impossibility of the genuine rhetorical art that Socrates has outlined, that even in reaching for the beautiful, there is beauty, and also in suffering what it is that one suffers en route. Since beauty in its radiance has always already given itself away, the gods must follow beauty in its descent into relative images in order to love beauty wholly. The gods' ascent to beauty can only be completed in an appreciation of beauty's self-presentation in others. The gods must descend to love beauty in its images. In this sense, beauty leads down the gods in its own descent into images, and the gods happily follow beauty's lead. The gods chase beauty all the way down, just as the philosopher must chase goodness all the way down to the furthest reaches of the cave, for the good penetrates even to those furthest reaches. The philosopher cannot love the good wholly unless she loves the good in all things, for all things are of the good. One cannot love beauty itself without also loving, or at least being disposed to love, all of the beautiful things. In a word, we might say one's ecstatic, anagogic, or upward leading, eros, for beauty itself, culminates when followed all the way to its end in what we might call a catagogic, or downward leading, care for relative beauties. For one does not love beauty wholly until one loves beauty in all beautiful things. While to say I love beauty in preference to beautiful things is sensible, to say I love beauty but not beautiful things would be a mark of confusion. To generalize the preceding point, we might say that the more something is genuinely erotic, the more it becomes genuinely epimeletic, or caring, in a downward fashion. Zeus's most perfect eros for beauty, signaled by his being the great leader who guides all upward towards beauty, culminates in his most perfect care for all things. Zeus is maximally erotic and reveals himself to be maximally epimeletic. The same point holds for the Palinode's divinely mad lover, who is first driven by a sight of a beautiful image in the beloved's face, to be led up and back to beauty itself, and upon making this contact in memory, is then driven back to genuinely care for his beloved. The erotically mad lover is genuinely erotic and subsequently reveals himself to be genuinely epimeletic because he has become genuinely erotic. Every soul, Socrates says, who is perfect and winged, and is thus perfectly erotic, insofar as wingedness seems to correspond to eroticism, governs the cosmos at large, whereas the soul who lost her feathers, and thus is less perfectly erotic, reveals itself to have a diminished scope of concern, since it becomes limited by the body for which it cares and to which it supplies life and motive power. The soul who has managed to receive a nourishing sight of truth proceeds to attend to her horse's needs, feasting them on nectar and ambrosia. By contrast, the corrupt soul, no longer inclined toward erotic ascent, shows a diminishment in its scope of concern to subhuman levels, allowing its horses to do as they will. Rather than feasting them on nectar and ambrosia, the corrupt soul allows its horses to pursue unnatural pleasure. In general, in the Phaedrus' cosmos, what's higher cares for what's lower, and it does so more adequately and more comprehensively the more that it itself is in loving communion with what's ultimate. The gods care for all because all things are radiant images of beauty. In their service to beauty, the gods seek to make those radiant images shine. The gods, in their care for all, seek to turn all things to their best conditions so that all things not only are, but are well, vividly, as exemplars in their kinds. When Zeus orders the cosmos, it's not just kosmeo, but dia kosmeo, thoroughly ordering the cosmos. He wants to make all of the cosmos shine with beauty's brilliance. The gods seek to make things shine so that each thing is so superabundantly itself that it can't but radiate its character for all to see. While the gods presumably cannot contribute to a given thing's radiant self-showing in the sense of imbuing it with light, for that role is reserved for beauty, and to do so, the gods would have to be a source of light, the gods can contribute to a given thing's radiant self-showing in other ways. They can remove what distorts something self-showing, as when Dionysus cures those plagued with ancient blood guilts. They can exhort something to be truly itself, as when Apollo commands us to know ourselves. They can reveal truths the recognition of which will contribute to human happiness, as when Apollo provides prophetic insight and the muses attend to the preservation of great historical deeds. They can care for and arrange things so that all turns out well, Zeus's providential care. They can themselves be radiant images of super heavenly realities. When we see, for example, that the gods each attend to their own business, we might see them as exemplars of justice. And most importantly for human souls, the gods can provide guides whom we can follow to that which we truly desire. The gods know the way to the super heavenly banquets, without which we cannot be adequately nourished. By helping us see what's truly desirable, the gods help us become more fully ourselves. In each of these ways, the gods help create the conditions whereby things can be fully themselves and shine all the more brightly. To humans, the gods bestow divine mania, which allows us to be more fully ourselves and thereby shine brightly as radiant images of the super heavenly realities. Further, insofar as divine mania can have effects irreducible to whatever is happening in the person directly inspired, the prophet can admonish, the poet can teach, the telestic purifier can heal, and the lover can reconnect with the divine. The gods' beauty-inspired work can have lasting effect in history. Incidentally, the second of two uses of koinōnia in the Phaedrus has to do with the way in which the divinely erotic madness is productive for not only the one who's directly inspired, but the one who communes with the one who's directly inspired. By descending into images and by inspiring the gods and also well-turned mortal souls to care for images, beauty gives us the means of returning to itself. Its images point to itself and present it to us, however inadequately. Beauty not only casts images which can lead us back to itself, but by leading the gods down to us to care for all, beauty has also provided guides who know the way back to beauty and who can lead us thereunto. Beauty has, in a sense, always already provided us with an auxiliary that can help us to avoid our tendency to misunderstand beautiful images. Beauty continually leads the gods up and then back down. As beauty descends and leads the gods down, it provides us an opportunity to be led up, either by radiant images or by the gods' guidance. When we are led up, we too can cooperate in the divine descent, wherein we come to caringly serve other human beings after following the gods up to beauty. So in closing, the main thesis here is that the beauty, by casting forth its radiant images, gives the gods a reason to go back down to us and thus care for us and lead us up into a communion with it. And when we commune with beauty, we, like the gods, will desire to also be led back down to commune with beauty wherever it comes and to make all of beauty's radiant images shine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan. A virtual clap. Yeah. Thank you. So we have a few minutes. Thank you for your being really close to the time, actually.
Closer than I thought.
Yeah. I can see that Will have a question for Ryan. William, would you like to start the debate?
Thanks a lot, Gabriele. Ryan, first of all, it strikes me that even if everything that you said was true, and that kind of means
William, I don't want to cut you off, but your voice dropped out.
Yeah.
Should I begin again?
Yeah, I
Yes,
can hear you now.
please.
Okay, sorry. So Ryan, even if everything that you said is true,
You
Sorry,
dropped
Will,
out
I
again.
think- yeah, you dropped out
no,
again.
I was muted. I got a little message saying that the host had muted me.
Oh, okay.
I'll try one last time and then I'll stop if it happens again. So again, even if everything you said was true, and that largely means that even if everything said by Socrates in the great second speech is true, that still does not establish that the Eleatic stranger is not being sophistic by using the verb koinonein to describe both physical and intellectual communion. So that I take it was the link that you wanted to start with, and I didn't see it. I loved the idea when you claimed that Zeus is the most erotic, because Zeus is, pretty famous for coming down to earth and raping women. As Christoph maybe will say as well, Christoph and I have both spent the last week in Poland, where we listened to many. Surely, Ryan, you should have delivered your paper there, because it was very much in harmony with the conference, which was very great speech centric. And I had the gadfly role of trying to question whether the great speech is anything much more than the speech of a seducer. In other words, of one that is trying to persuade the audience to have sex with him, which is, of course, the stated purpose of the speech in 265, to gratify the eronti. So this is my question. Your remarks about the Phaedrus were completely centered on the great speech. I'd be curious to hear your approach to the old unity of the Phaedrus problem, because you were so focused on the great speech. As you very well know, at 265 in the analytic section, Socrates makes it very clear, reflecting on his own speech, that, well, maybe there was some truth in it. Maybe it was, parapheromeni in another direction. And I didn't hear any of that. I didn't hear any of that self-criticism in your remarks. It struck me as a very beautifully Neoplatonic reading of the great speech, very reminiscent of some of the things I've just heard in Poland. But I didn't feel I felt that it was unbalanced in the way that Plato clearly wanted the Phaedrus to be unbalanced, but he also wanted us to find the unity of it. So I'd just be curious, Ryan, since you've thought about this dialogue a great deal, what is your approach to the unity of the Phaedrus, given your very strong, great speech-centric approach in this paper?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And it will probably come as no surprise that if I were to tell you my whole thing, right, my whole interpretation, it's also very great speech centric, but that's because the great speech comes in the center, right? It makes some sense that it would be centered there. But I've been developing a full length interpretation specifically addressing the unity problem, and my proposal is that it's soul leading sukagogia is the unity of the Phaedrus.
Could you say that again? I didn't hear that.
Soul leading sukagogia is the unity of the Phaedrus, and that more specifically the everything in the Phaedrus revolves around the idea of being led into communion with reality. So I mean, that's very clear from the great speech that kind of thing could make sense as the theme there. It's less clear, especially in the latter section, and as you know, there are some qualifications of the great speech in the latter section, in the 260s somewhere. But I think that those can all be accounted for if we attend to soul leading as the unifying theme.
But you agree that sukagogia can lead you to the truth or lead you to error as well. I mean, in other words, that it's a double-edged pharmacon, not to sound too much like our friend Jacques Derrida.
Yeah, of course. It's ambiguous, and there's the Phaedrus is a remarkably ambiguous dialogue. Pretty much everything that it puts forward at one point as a positive also shows up as a negative in some way, sometimes at the same time. And further, some of the things that are put forward as a negative can show themselves as a positive. I have a suggestion that we owe a Palino de Boreas at some point as well, which is perhaps a little surprising. But yeah, so I guess your question then would be how to deal with the negativity there, if that's the theme, right? How to deal with the fact that soul leading can evoke the dead from from the underworld and is analogous to necromancy and all this other kind of nasty stuff that we hear in that word. I think part of the function of the Phaedrus is to give us the tools for distinguishing between a genuine soul leading and a soul leading that is not oriented to reality, and the orientation to reality is the distinguishing mark. So when love is truly love, it leads to beauty itself, however it gets there. And when language is truly language, it leads to a disclosure of reality, however it gets there. And so when language is not oriented toward the disclosure of reality, or when love is not oriented towards beauty itself, those things are actually not really themselves. They are, as Aristotle would say, analogous, like a corpse is analogous to a human being, or like the eyes, the painting of the eye is analogous to the eye, but is really an eye in name only.
Thank you, Ryan. We should probably move on for 2 more questions, if you may. So Lenner has a question, I believe. Would you be? Yes.
Yes. Do you
Thank
hear
you.
me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Actually, I had a question similar to the last question of the previous of William Altman. But so to connect it and to try to go a bit further, because it seemed to me really precisely that you focused on the positive fact of psychagogia, but as you said at the last question, there is this really ambiguity of psychagogia. Because of the ambiguity of seduction, it can lead you upwards, or it can lead you downwards. But it seemed to me that you interpret the fact that even gods and we can be led downwards towards beauty in a positive sense, very Neoplatonic, precisely, but to me a very late Neoplatonic, so Prokos, Eros, Pronoetikos, and so on. But if I'm not sure if this is. This might be late Neoplatonic, but I'm really not sure if this is Platonic in the sense of Phaedrus in Plato, because how do you explain fully the fact that gods descend because beauty descends and they love Eros? Does that make sense really for Plato, that Eros positively goes downwards? That's my main issue, my main problem. And so, as you said at the end, that psychagogia is not every time correct, because precisely he says true rhetoric is psychagogia, and the right use of it, to orton. So there is a bad use of it, and so we can be seduced by Gorgias and so on, and by a sophistic speech. And just as it seems to me that we can be seduced by a human speech, by a human sophist, and be led downwards, so too I think doesn't that make sense that gods are led downwards negatively or secondarily, that the positive aspect of Eros is always in Plato, at least upwards?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So part of what I'm trying to do is to push back against that that thesis, right? So that's a longstanding thesis that Eros is always upward oriented in Plato. That's, I mean, as a whole kind of ancient philosophy into late antiquity, that's just a kind of commonplace. And I'm trying to say, I don't think that is the whole story. I think that the ascent has to be actually fulfilled and completed by a descent. And so there is as I was trying to say, there's a downward sense that comes out of our fullness of our upwardness. But 2 other remarks. So one thing that's kind of interesting here is that Plato reserves the language of upwardness and downwardness as kind of spatial metaphor only for the upward is always associated with, going up to the super heavenly place, what Eros does to us. Downward only really shows up in this word katagoge. And so when he talks about soul leading as misleading or rhetoric as misleading, he never talks about it as leading us downward. He instead uses words like paragon, leading aside. So the spatial metaphor there is actually, he nowhere says that rhetoricians or sophists are down leaders. That's actually, I think nowhere in Plato is that actually said. Interestingly, Hermias, the late Neoplatonic commentator on the Phaedrus, does use that term. He says that good speeches are anagogic, bad speeches are catagogic, but that's actually the innovation there. That's not in Plato. In Plato, kata stuff is actually, seems to be positive rather than a negative thing. And the other remark that is now leaving me as I am saying this.
Just can I a little bit question? Thank you for.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I will. We have two more questions, and I think that we are usually out of our time, and so I think we can maybe skip the second question. Sorry.
Okay, but
so Ryan,
we can talk in email too, of course, right?
Yes, I think it's better. So let's have Alan and then Edward to make. Alan, would you?
Thanks, Gabriele.
Yes.
Great talk, Ryan. I learned a lot, and I think you're onto something really important. I don't know if it's ultimately correct, but maybe I could invite you to kind of say in response to what's coming up now, right? Something like, what's the difference between a love that has actually descended and if I understand you right, a proper descent only comes after an ascent. That's right? Okay, so what's the difference between someone, how do we distinguish between someone who is just sort of, messing around with the images and has not ascended, and someone who is with the images, but it's a proper love that has taken that prior ascent? Like, how do we tell those two apart? Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. And I think the dialogue gives us interesting resources, especially at 253 and 255 and thereabouts. It's the kind of the major places. At 255A, if I have my text on hand, I think the kind of key text for my interpretation on that is 255A, when Socrates says, right after that scene where the struggle in the soul and the charioteer finally restrains the black horse so that it does what the charioteer wants it to do, Socrates says, because the boy is now waited on in every possible way as if he were a god, the lover is no longer pretending, but truly feels his servitude. So I think that's the key point there, is that someone who has not completed the ascent and then descended back to the images treats the images in something like a mock servitude. So there's a kind of, I'm trying to extract what is nourishing to me from this thing without any regard or care for the thing itself. Whereas the lover who ascends now comes back down and cares about the thing itself.
That's interesting. Yeah. Thanks.
Wonderful. Then, Edward, maybe the last question. Thank you, Edward.
Thank you. And this is sort of along the same lines. I'm puzzled about the descent and what's actually descending here. So as I read the latter, it's an ascent. Most people read it that way. That there's a pursuit and then the kind of restraint, but not really a descent. And then the restraint allows for the possibility of a certain reciprocity. So I wonder if you could say just some more about how you're reading this passage. I think it's around 255 where he's talking about the ladder, what seems to be a kind of ladder.
Yeah, and of course, when you bring up ladders too, the same kind of issue in the symposium, right, in Diadema's speech. And I think both speeches are consistent on this point. I think there's an argument to be made that there is a similar kind of dissent in Diadema's speech as well. So part of the issue is I don't think that it's just about restraint at the end of the day. I think that restraint and virtue are to be distinguished, right? And we have those kind of distinctions are familiar to us from Aristotle, right? And that what restraint would be if the kind of the white horse holds us back from just kind of jumping on the thing. Whereas what virtue would be if the white horse and the black horse are both doing whatever the charioteer wants it to do, assuming the charioteer is well directed, which is kind of part of the assumption, I think, when the charioteer is looking for reality. It's doing so. That's part of what it should be doing. So when we get to the kind of the discussion of the philosophical couple versus the couple who loves honor rather than wisdom at the end of the palinode, the philosophical couple has restraint built within it, but it is not motivated by restraint, right? It has the right relation to the desire for pleasure, but it's not antagonistic towards the desire for pleasure, because it's not the two horses fighting each other as it is in the couple who loves honor rather than wisdom. I'm not sure that completely answers your question, but is that getting in the right direction?
Well, I'm wondering why that's a descent. That's what's really puzzling to me.
Yeah. So why we could say the lover is descending back to the beloved? That's what you mean? Because yes. So when the lover first beholds the beloved, he sees an image of beauty. But because something clicks and awakens in him, he is transported beyond the image of beauty to beauty itself in memory. But then once seeing beauty itself, now the lover doesn't just see the beloved as a vehicle for seeing beauty itself, but instead sees the beloved as something that needs to be genuinely cared for, as a kind of real manifestation of beauty that needs to be desired for its own sake rather than simply as a vehicle. So I take the genuine service, not pretending, to pretty strongly on that point, I think.
Okay, thank you. That does help. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I think now it's time to move. Yes. Thank you. This virtual labs. So let's move to Gabriel Garcia, and I hope he's ready.
Yeah. Thank you, Gabriele.
Oh yes, I can see you right now.
I could start. So, thank you all. I'm the organization also. With all the
you are.
I am talking in Spanish, so I thought I could show my text, but I have the problem with this now, so I'm asking for it. But I can start with the first words, or I will start to talk, and when I know that I could share my screen, I will do that. So, la ciencia en sí misma y la ciencia en nosotros, en torno al rol de la epistēmē en el Fedro. La descripción del viaje del alma a un lugar supraceleste o topos superuráneos en el segundo discurso de Sócrates en el Fedro, conocido como la palinodia, plantea una descripción sucinta del ámbito idético que surge de la necesidad de atreverse a decir la verdad. Pretende suplir una falta de todos los poetas presentes y futuros, a saber que ninguno de ellos plantea un himno que corresponda a su dignidad. No es pues una pretensión menor la que alienta esta descripción, que en apretadas líneas condensa varios aspectos tanto de la naturaleza de dicho ámbito como de la experiencia que se produce al entrar en contacto con él. La brevedad del pasaje y la acumulación de tópicos plantea, empero, varios problemas de interpretación. No es mi intención recorrer aquí todos ellos, sino concentrarme en la descripción de los contenidos que el alma examina en el topos superuráneos: justicia, dikaiosune, sensatez, sofrosune, y ciencia, epistēmē. Únicamente de esta última ofrece Sócrates una descripción que por ello adquiere el rol de explicación central en 247.5 Hace ya varios años, Wilhelm Schwabe planteó una interpretación exhaustiva de este pasaje en Der Geistcharakter des überhimmlischen Raumes para en torno a una corrección de la interpretación dominante de Fedro 247 CE. Su explicación sistemática encuentra en las palabras de Sócrates una presentación sintética de los aspectos centrales de toda la filosofía platónica y por ello se sumerge en un mar de argumentos cuya justificación satisfactoria exige del autor demasiadas líneas de defensa. En términos aristotélicos, podría decirse que Schwabe multiplica los problemas que hay que resolver. Sin embargo, pese a su carácter especulativo, me parece que sigue siendo válida su decidida defensa de la diferenciación entre una ciencia propia del topos hiperuráneos y una ciencia en la génesis, vale decir, en las almas que adquieren el conocimiento de las ideas. Pretendo aquí establecer una observación más detallada de esta tesis, siguiendo sus implicancias para el resto del diálogo y recurriendo eventualmente a algunos pocos puntos de apoyo más allá del Fedro, extraídos principalmente de la República, el Simposio y el Cármides, de modo que la cercanía temática de estas obras permita complementar lo expuesto en el Fedro. Dividiré mi exposición en 4 partes. Primero, intentaré plantear brevemente los puntos que me parecen excesivamente problemáticos en la interpretación de Schwabe, para colocar límites precisos a mi propia interpretación. En segundo lugar, me centraré en su exégesis del pasaje clave 247 D5E2, pero reemplazaré sus referencias a otras obras del corpus con pasajes que a mi juicio apoyan mejor su tesis principal. De particular utilidad resultará la descripción de la ciencia en el ámbito de la génesis propuesta en Simposio 207 E5 208 A7, porque permitirá identificar la ciencia humana con la memoria, neme. La tercera parte examinará el uso de la memoria en el Fedro, tanto dentro de la palinodia como en la crítica de la escritura. Finalmente, la última parte estará dedicada a establecer qué consecuencias se siguen de la concepción de la ciencia humana como memoria para una interpretación de la ciencia en el topos hiperuráneos. Primera parte. El problema principal del texto de Schwabe es la secuencia de su argumentación. Su tesis central, como veremos con más detalle en la siguiente sección, es que Sócrates diferencia 2 tipos de ciencia a través de su localización, que Schwabe interpreta en el sentido de inherencia, en 2 lugares distintos, el topos hiperuráneos y el ámbito de la génesis. Pero pretende extraer de dicha diferenciación no solamente una tesis plausible, a saber, que una ciencia en el topos hiperuráneos plantea la posibilidad de un intelecto divino o nous inherente al ámbito de las ideas, sino que Schwabe va mucho más allá al plantear que dicho intelecto debe necesariamente distinguirse de la idea del bien. Tampoco la contraposición que propone entre Platón y Aristóteles puede ser base suficiente para sostener la diferencia entre bien e intelecto, toda vez que es precisamente lo que se necesita demostrar. A esto se añade la referencia a varios pasajes del corpus, que si bien brindan indicios favorables a la interpretación de la inherencia del nous en las ideas, constituyen por sí mismos problemas de interpretación aparte y merecen por tanto un tratamiento diferenciado. Así, por ejemplo, la referencia a Fedón 80 AB, donde se plantea que las ideas son lo que gobierna y a lo que se asemeja el alma más bien que el cuerpo, no basta para plantear un carácter anímico de las ideas, como tampoco lo hace por sí misma la crítica de Sócrates a la insuficiente concepción del nous de Anaxágoras en el mismo diálogo. Tampoco es convincente subrayar que los antiguos consideraban el cielo como un ámbito habitado por dioses, para presuponer lo mismo en la alegoría de la caverna, y la interpretación de las ciencias o epistēmē en la escalera de Eros del Simposio como parte del ámbito eidético no puede sostenerse sin una mayor justificación. Por último, la interpretación de los pasajes anteriores a la descripción del topos hiperuráneos en el propio Fedro expone varias tesis que requieren de una fundamentación más precisa, como la identificación de los dioses con almas incorpóreas, que se encuentran por ello en el plano del alma del mundo, razón por la cual presuponen un demiurgo en un nivel metafísico anterior, esto es, el de las ideas. O la otra tesis de Schwabe, de que ellas, las ideas, al ser sofón, son objeto del pensamiento de un sabio que no puede ser el intelecto humano. Finalmente, que la descripción del topos hiperuráneos se produzca bajo la forma de un himno y presuponga por tanto el carácter personal de una divinidad como referente, la última tesis de Schwabe, que no tomo en cuenta aquí, no tiene en cuenta que las ideas funcionan en el discurso como totheion, aquello que es querido por los dioses que realizan el viaje hacia ellas, pero que son explícitamente diferentes de los dioses. Schwabe refiere también a otros pasajes del corpus que sí son directamente relevantes, porque sí establecen un margen para tematizar el problema de la presencia del nous en las ideas. Pero nuevamente la tarea principal consiste en mostrar la plausibilidad de esa tesis en el Fedro mismo. Dejaremos por ello estos pasajes momentáneamente de lado y los recogeremos al final de esta exposición. Cuando pasa el examen directo del Fedro, Schwabe plantea una interpretación de la primera parte de la descripción del topos hyperuranios excesivamente cargada de presupuestos. En ella, Sócrates indica la naturaleza básica del ámbito eidético sobre la base de 3 aspectos. Se trata de la ousia ontos ousa, que podríamos traducir como el ser que es verdaderamente, caracterizada como incolora, sin figura e intangible, que además es contemplada solamente por el nous, piloto del alma, y finalmente en torno a la cual se da el género de la ciencia verdadera. Esta última frase, perigen totes alethus epistemes genos, es referida por Schwabe ya en este primer momento a una ciencia que por extenderse en el ámbito eidético y ser verdadera, es ya intrínseca al ámbito de las ideas y por tanto ya no consiste en una mera idea, vale decir, en una determinación más entre otras. Pero aquí es donde se muestra con más claridad el problema de su argumentación, pues una lectura inmediata del pasaje no permite encontrar dicha referencia. Totes alethus epistemes genos puede muy bien referir a la ciencia verdadera como identidad de género de todo conocimiento que se extienda sobre las ideas. Hombres y dioses en la palinodia alcanzan verdadero conocimiento cuando entran en contacto con el topos hyperuranios, sin que ello implique necesariamente que allí mismo existe una ciencia verdadera. En realidad, es la posterior descripción de la epistēmē con su doble caracterización entre el ámbito eidético y sensible lo que permite releer este pasaje de otra manera. Porque hay una ciencia en el topos hyperuranios, debe admitirse que la frase totes alethus epistemes genos puede extenderse más allá del conocimiento de hombres y de dioses. Finalmente, el análisis que Schwabe ofrece del siguiente momento de la descripción del topos hyperuranios sí es más convincente. Sócrates indica que el alma del dios es alimentada no te kai epistēmē akerato, con intelecto y ciencia puros. Es correcto identificar nous y epistēmē con el alimento del alma, que será llamado después ta alethē, lo verdadero, pues la misma fórmula, trefomai con complemento dativo, aparece un poco más adelante en el mismo sentido, en 248 B7 y C2. Schwabe plantea aquí un punto claro y contundente. Sin embargo,
Gabriel,
este pasaje no es concluyente. Sí, dime,
puedes
Robert.
compartir, puedes compartir.
Ah, ya, qué bueno. Qué bueno. Gracias. Gracias por avisar. Creo que ya están viendo, ¿no?
Sí, sí, está claro.
Ok, gracias. Vamos a la segunda parte. Para lo que sigue será necesario citar completo el tercer momento de la caracterización del topos hyperuranios. Vino en el momento oportuno porque es el pasaje de griego en griego más importante de la ponencia, que es este donde se describe qué es lo que ve el alma, ¿no? Ve la justicia, la sofrosine, la epistēmē, y luego se da esta descripción de la epistēmē que voy a analizar a continuación. Luego de mencionar los 3 objetos principales de la visión del alma, justicia, sensatez y ciencia, Sócrates se detiene exclusivamente en la ciencia para precisar su naturaleza en contraste con otro tipo de ciencia. Opera a través de 2 contraposiciones. En primer lugar, se distingue una ciencia a la que se añade, prosestin, la génesis, de otra que es verdaderamente ciencia, ontos epistemen usan, donde el participio usa se refiere a la epistēmē, objeto de visión en el topos hyperuranios. En segundo lugar, la ciencia fuera del ámbito eidético se caracteriza en formulación de Emilio Lledó como siendo otra al ser en otro, a saber, en otro dentro de lo que ahora llamamos seres. En contraste con la ciencia que es en lo que es ser, en toho estinon usan, distinguiendo así lo que es de lo que decimos que es, que sería la característica de la otra ciencia. La traducción que ofrezco supone los resultados de la interpretación de Schwabe, que critica las versiones modernas del Fedro en este pasaje. El problema central está en la traducción de lo que podríamos denominar la expresión engetero tini einan. También la traducción de Yedo interpreta erróneamente esta expresión como una referencia al objeto de cada ciencia. Es decir, una ciencia que trata de lo sensible en un caso se distinguiría de otra que trata de lo inteligible en el otro. Schwabe muestra que no hay testimonios de un uso semejante de la preposición en para expresiones del conocimiento. Además, Platón utiliza frecuentemente el genitivo objetivo o la expresión prosti para referirse a esta relación entre un conocimiento y su objeto, aunque el ejemplo planteado para ello por Schwabe no resulta convincente. Se trata de la última aporía de la primera parte del Parménides, particularmente 133c8 y 134a y siguientes. Si bien allí se plantea la relación entre la ciencia y su objeto a través de un genitivo objetivo, no se discute directamente la naturaleza de la ciencia, sino las consecuencias que la falta de koinōnia entre lo sensible y lo inteligible trae para el conocimiento, como hemos visto en una exposición hoy también. Más conveniente resulta remitir a dos pasajes que sí se detienen en la naturaleza del epistēmē, a saber, Cármides, 106.7c8, 106.8a8, que examina la posibilidad de una ciencia de sí misma y de las otras ciencias, y República 4437b7, 438e8, dentro de la delimitación del referente de la epithumía. En efecto, en ambos pasajes se incluye a la ciencia dentro de una categoría mayor de realidades prosti. En el primero, Sócrates pasa revista a varias actividades anímicas y concluye sosteniendo el carácter relacional de la epistēmē con la ayuda de un genitivo. Acá está la cita correspondiente con el genitivo correspondiente. La discusión ulterior incluye una referencia a las relaciones comparativas formuladas también en genitivo de comparación, y al final del pasaje a través de la expresión prosti. En la República se parte nuevamente de algunas actividades anímicas y se vuelve a establecer el carácter relacional de las mismas a partir de la epithumía a través del genitivo. El carácter relacional puro se obtiene de la determinación general de relaciones comparativas de carácter matemático, para lo cual se recurre nuevamente al genitivo y a la construcción prosti. Concluye el pasaje con una referencia general a la epistēmē. Con ella sucede del mismo modo, indicando que la epistēmē es también siempre de algo. Ambos ejemplos muestran que la relación entre la epistēmē y su objeto no puede expresarse satisfactoriamente con la preposición en. La ciencia que se encuentra fuera del topo superuráneo se da, por tanto, en algo distinto de ella y que pertenece a las cosas de las que ahora decimos que son. Es adecuado remitir aquí con Schwabe a Simposio 211a, donde se aplica la expresión engetero tini a la presencia de lo bello en animales, en el cielo o en alguna otra cosa o en el resto. Resulta por ello razonable entender que esta ciencia consiste en una manifestación en los seres animados capaces de conocimiento. Pero nuevamente se debe corregir el enfoque de Schwabe, que para explicar las relaciones de inherencia apela a la física de Aristóteles, donde se establece que el ser en otro se dice en muchos sentidos. Este camino me parece inadecuado porque presupone un grado de continuidad entre Platón y Aristóteles que requiere de mayor justificación. Directa, en cambio, es la necesidad de asociar la sabiduría con el alma o el intelecto, como Schwabe recoge de Timeo 30b y de Filebo 33c9 y siguiente. Pero existe otra posibilidad para examinar la relación de inherencia de la ciencia en el ámbito sensible. Ya en el Eutidemo había planteado Dionisodoro el problema que suscita explicar en qué sentido algo puede estar presente en otra cosa. La sugerencia socrática es que el vínculo entre lo bello y algo bello requiere de una cierta belleza, kalos tis, en el fenómeno. Podemos examinar en qué consiste esta cierta ciencia que correspondería a esta pretensión socrática, que debe estar presente en la Génesis, a través de Simposio 207.5, 208a7, que Schwabe toca tangencialmente al final de su texto. Si bien reconoce que este pasaje complementa el del Fedro, porque describe la ciencia en el ámbito de la Génesis, no examina cómo esa descripción ayuda a comprender la estructura de la ciencia en el Fedro mismo. El pasaje del Simposio se encuentra dentro de la definición de Eros como deseo de inmortalidad. Este deseo no debe entenderse como la tendencia hacia una meta inalcanzable para el ser mortal, más bien la inmortalidad se busca hasta donde es posible, katadúnaton, lo cual solamente puede consistir para el ser perecible en perdurar, vale decir, en evitar que la felicidad desaparezca. Pero solamente se puede perdurar en la génesis a través del reemplazo de lo viejo por lo nuevo. Con ello se produce una identidad meramente nominal del objeto, pues el proceso de sustitución implica que realmente no se mantiene nunca lo mismo, sino que la identidad en la génesis se da únicamente de nombre. Y se usa el mismo verbo que se usa en Fedro, kaleitai, para las cosas que llamamos, digamos, unas. En la formulación del Fedro, la identidad de la génesis es una característica constitutiva de las cosas que ahora llamamos seres, una suerte de cuasi-identidad, que es como se llama este fenómeno en el simposio. Ahora bien, este rasgo constitutivo se extiende no solamente a los seres, sino también explícitamente a cada uno de los conocimientos en el simposio, cuya identidad en la génesis es aparente. El conocimiento se pierde por el olvido y es el ejercicio melete lo que reemplaza la memoria perdida a través de una nueva memoria. Esta identidad aparente de la ciencia contrasta con lo divino, que es siempre lo mismo, to auto aei eina. La formulación, como puede notarse, es paralela a la planteada en el Fedro y permite comprender mejor la diferencia entre ambas ciencias. Mientras que la epistēmē del topos hyperuráneos es una sola realidad idéntica a sí misma, la epistēmē en el ámbito humano consiste en la secuencia de sucesivas memorias. Por tanto, la manifestación de la ciencia divina en la humana se produce particularmente en la memoria, mnēmē, que otorga a la ciencia sensible su fundamento. Tercera parte. El rol fundamental que tiene la memoria para la ciencia humana también se encuentra en el Fedro. En 249 C1.6 se establece un contraste entre anamnesis y mnēmē. La primera, en tanto proceso de reminiscencia de la visión del topos hyperuráneos, es asignada a toda alma humana, pero únicamente las almas filosóficas se encuentran junto a los objetos del topos hyperuráneos en tanto les es posible con la memoria. El proceso de recordar la anamnesis se distingue de este modo de la memoria, mnēmē, que consiste en el fin de ese proceso, la presencia en el topos hyperuráneos. También en la experiencia erótica se produce una referencia a la memoria. Primero, como recuerdo del amado que incita el desarrollo de las alas, en 251 de 6. Este recuerdo, sin embargo, contrasta con la presencia efectiva del amado. El auténtico contacto del alma encarnada con su divinidad correspondiente, en cambio, se produce exclusivamente por la memoria y hace surgir en el alma formas de ser que se toman de la divinidad misma, exekeinum lambanum cita desde epistēmē. Finalmente, se produce otra memoria durante la visión de las ideas. Cuando el nus observa al amado, la memoria es transportada hacia la naturaleza de lo bello. Esta vez se mencionan únicamente lo bello y la sensatez, o frosyne, como objetos de la visión. El contacto produce aquí el surgimiento de una forma de sensatez, a saber el autodominio o encráteia, al tirar de las riendas de los deseos, y explícitamente también una forma de la vergüenza, surge la vergüenza de syne, que es una forma tradicional de sofrosyne. Examinaremos este pasaje con algo más de detalle al final de esta presentación. Aquí me interesa resaltar la repetición de lo sucedido con la memoria de la divinidad. Al encontrarse ante la presencia de esta realidad, las ideas, el alma adquiere una forma de sensatez. Algo semejante debería suceder con la experiencia de la justicia y la ciencia. El segundo momento importante para una explicación de la ciencia humana en el Fedro y su relación con la memoria se encuentra en la parte final del diálogo, en lo que se conoce como la crítica de la escritura. Para no sumergirnos ahora en los problemas de una interpretación general de este pasaje, porque una polémica de este tipo excedería con creces los límites de esta presentación, me centraré únicamente en los aspectos relevantes para la caracterización de la ciencia y la memoria en los tres constituyentes de la crítica de la escritura: el mito de Zeus, la analogía con la pintura y la analogía con el labrador sensato. Supondré para ello que los contenidos de la palinodia siguen siendo válidos para el resto del diálogo. El mito de Zeus plantea la naturaleza y potencia fundamental de la escritura. Lo primero que cabe notar es la ambigüedad respecto de su origen. Su padre la asocia directamente con los conocimientos, mientras que el rechazo de Tamus implica que su lugar está más bien entre los juegos. La escritura produce olvido causado por la falta de ejercicio de la memoria. Si entendemos estos términos en el sentido preciso del simposio, la escritura no permite la transición de una mnēmē a otra, vale decir, interrumpe el proceso de continuidad de la epistēmē en el ámbito sensible. En efecto, Sócrates concentra la crítica a la escritura en el ámbito de la enseñanza, contrastando la confianza que el escrito produce en caracteres ajenos con el proceso de reminiscencia emprendido por el individuo mismo, proceso que, como vimos en la Palidodia, culmina con la adquisición de una nueva mneme. Finalmente, la diferencia entre mneme, memoria, y hipómnesis, recordatorio, muestra que la memoria no puede consistir en un mero recuerdo de palabras. En esto, el pasaje contrasta con aquella pretensión inicial de Fedro, que quiere aprender de memoria el discurso de Lisias y busca para ello ejercitarse en su estudio. En la crítica de la escritura, este tipo de ejercicio se considera descuido de la memoria. De ahí que el problema del escrito no se reduce a su incapacidad para explicar el punto de vista del maestro, lo cual podría complementarse con ulteriores aclaraciones, que no hay ningún impedimento para ello, podrían a su vez ponerse también por escrito. El problema es la incapacidad del escrito para producir una mneme, motivo por el cual se indica que no pueden producir nada claro ni duradero. Nada claro, porque la única visión clara de las ideas ha sido ya conceptualizada como memoria. Nada duradero, porque no permite la continuidad en la génesis del conocimiento, vale decir, no propicia el surgimiento de una nueva mneme en el aprendiz. De ahí la segunda característica fundamental con la que culmina el mito de Zeus. El escrito, en tanto hipómnesis, es un recordatorio para quien ya posee el conocimiento. Conocimiento y recordatorio no deben, por tanto, confundirse. La analogía con la pintura permite ahondar en la naturaleza del mneme por contraste con el escrito. En primer lugar, es necesario precisar que la comparación se refiere a dos formas de producción. La producción de escritos y de pinturas se asemejan porque producen imágenes sin vida, vale decir, incapaces de acción. La pintura, imágenes como si estuvieran vivas, hotzonta, y la escritura, otra imagen como si tuviera conocimiento, hostifronuntas. Pero el carácter inerte del escrito muestra su total naturaleza por su inutilidad para el aprendiz. En contraste, quien posee conocimiento, esto es mneme, escribe con epistēmē en el alma del aprendiz. El discurso del hombre que sabe, logos tueidotos, consiste, al igual que un escrito, en un producto, ekonon, solo que éste surge y crece en el alma del aprendiz. No se compara entonces el conocimiento mismo del filósofo, sino los logoi escritos con los logoi orientados a la educación. Los discursos del hombre que sabe están vivos debido a su capacidad de adaptación a la situación de enseñanza. Que estén acompañados de ciencia explica la principal característica de este logos, a saber, la capacidad de defenderse. Esta defensa implica, como ha mostrado Thomas Schlesser en varias oportunidades, la posibilidad de recurrir a otros argumentos, principalmente de mayor valor. Pero se trata virtualmente de una compleja red de argumentos, que si ha de apelar a los aspectos relevantes en cada caso de enseñanza, parece infinita. La ciencia funciona entonces como límite de esos argumentos y en tanto memoria del ámbito eidético constituye el modelo de posibles relaciones. Si las posibilidades de argumentación del maestro no fuesen en principio abiertas, no tendría sentido distinguir entre mneme y hipómnema, pues bastaría con establecer un repertorio limitado de argumentos didácticos y por ende una cantidad específica de argumentos susceptibles de ser puestos por escrito. Con ello, la segunda parte de la crítica de la escritura se muestra compatible con la identificación de epistēmē y mneme. Pasemos ahora al último momento de la crítica. Aquí se introduce el tema de las expectativas razonables con las que un maestro debe emprender la producción de logoi escritos y orales, entendidos estos últimos como logoi aplicados a la enseñanza directa. Interesante para nuestro tema es la relación que se establece entre los logoi orales y la ciencia, particularmente al final del pasaje. El labrador sensato posee un saber sobre lo justo, lo bello y lo bueno, lo cual significa en el marco de esta presentación que este saber consiste en la epistēmē como conocimiento del topos superuráneos. Respecto de qué es lo que siembra, el texto plantea una ambigüedad. El inicio de la imagen sugiere, en continuidad con la imagen anterior, que el labrador sensato siembra discursos, pero en 276 y 79 los logoi se consideran únicamente instrumentos para plantar las semillas. Luego, los sembrados son nuevamente y luego en un pasaje posterior, los sembrados son nuevamente los discursos y la ciencia aquello que los acompaña. La ambigua relación entre logo y epistēmē encuentra un punto culminante en el pasaje 276-6, 277-4. Cito acá el pasaje en extenso, pero acá coloco también su interpretación. Los frutos que el labrador sensato espera producir se convierten aquí en las semillas que poseen los logoi orientados a la educación, y con ello se distinguen de los discursos mismos, como resalta Rowe en su comentario al pasaje. Los logoi del maestro ya no son ellos mismos semillas, sino que poseen semilla. Se trata de los contenidos que en la analogía con la pintura hacían que el logos del hombre que sabe esté vivo. Son takaem, decía en ese momento Sócrates. Al plantarse los logoi, son tutae athanaton paregen hikanoi. Si bien algunos traductores entienden aquí athanaton como complemento adverbial, como lo hace Rowe, puede considerarse también como referido a tuto, con lo cual la traducción quedaría capaces de proveer siempre esto inmortal. Inmortal en ese sentido se referiría a las semillas. La expresión aloi en alois ethesi phiomenoi tutoai athanaton paregen hikanoi plantea de este modo una concepción semejante a la ya presentada en el simposio y refuerza la identificación de neme y la manifestación de la epistēmē en el ámbito humano. Hasta aquí he intentado plantear una identificación de la ciencia en la génesis con la memoria. En la última sección intentaré establecer algunas consecuencias generales que se desprenden de esta lectura para la concepción de la ciencia en el topos hyperuranos. Tercera parte, la más breve. Sintetizando los resultados de la sección anterior, podemos decir que la ciencia humana se caracteriza por el vínculo establecido por el ejercicio melete entre sucesivas memorias, que son a su vez conocimientos directos del ámbito eidético. La memoria es lo que se encuentra como algo distinto en algo distinto, ya sea para el propio filósofo, cuyos escritos son recordatorios de dicha visión, como a través de la enseñanza. La memoria es la manifestación de la ciencia en la génesis. Resta analizar qué consecuencias tiene esto para la concepción del episteme en el topos hyperuranos. Tanto justicia como sensatez y ciencia se proponen como rasgos centrales del ámbito eidético. Hemos descartado que la selección de estas tres características sea arbitraria debido al contexto extremadamente sintético de la descripción del topos hyperuranos. Nuevamente retomaré aquí algunas reflexiones de Schwabe como punto de partida para la discusión. Schwabe contrapone las ideas entendidas como determinaciones individuales a las tres virtudes escogidas aquí como descripción de la dimensión espiritual de todo el cosmos inteligible. En realidad, el contraste no es del todo necesario si atendemos a la descripción de la justicia en el ámbito eidético, tal como se plantea en República 500C4 y siguiente. Las ideas no cometen ni padecen injusticias entre sí. No existe ningún impedimento para entender la justicia aquí como un eidos que, si bien tiene una determinación per se, se puede comprender a través de la koinonia de las formas, anunciada ya en República en 476 a 57. Es propio, pues, de todas las ideas el manifestarse, Feinstein, de diversas maneras en las relaciones al interior del ámbito eidético. Lo que distingue la justicia es que, por decirlo de algún modo, aparece en todo el cosmos de las ideas, en la delimitación de unas ideas respecto de las otras. Pero de ello no se desprende necesariamente el carácter espiritual o noético de las ideas. Respecto de la sensatez, Schwabe resalta su definición como sinfonía en República, pero además de una problemática cercanía a la noción de justicia admitida por Schwabe, es necesario notar el uso que se hace de ella en la experiencia erótica dentro del Fedro. Como mencionamos anteriormente, permite al alma sofrenarse y controlar las pasiones. Si bien algo semejante es inadmisible en el topos hyperuranos, la sinfonía mencionada por Schwabe debe complementarse con la discusión de la misma en el Cármides, donde se explora la posibilidad de una ciencia en la ciencia. Como se ha señalado ayer, esta autorreflexividad no tiene sentido si la ciencia se refiere a sí misma, pues al carecer de contenido como ciencia per se, requiere de una referencia al bien. Pero si es posible una episteme en el ámbito eidético, la autorreferencialidad que plantea el Cármides debe ser nuevamente discutida. Para que la visión sea capaz de mirarse a sí misma, dice Sócrates en el Cármides, tiene que poseer un color. Pero el problema solo se puede solucionar si no hay nada que por naturaleza tenga el poder de referirse a sí misma, si se investiga, si no hay nada que por naturaleza tenga el poder de referirse a sí mismo, pero sí a otro, o bien algunas cosas sí y otras no. Pero además, si hay cosas, sean las que sean, que se refieran a sí mismas, si entre ellas se encuentra el saber ese en el que nosotros decimos que consiste la sensatez. La sensatez está íntimamente ligada a la naturaleza del episteme. Sobre esta última hemos visto que la neme se ha caracterizado por ser núcleo vivificante en el ámbito de la génesis. Su carácter de conocimiento activo sí permite por ello asociarla con aquellos otros pasajes de la obra de Platón que plantean el ámbito eidético como un ser vivo, la atribución de, entre otros, vida en ser verdadero, si entendemos de este modo el pantelos on de sofista, la caracterización del modelo inteligible como ser vivo perfecto e inteligible en el timeo, el comportamiento idéntico de los seres más divinos en político, como los casos más saltantes, pero ello deberá ser objeto de una investigación ulterior. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Gabriel. No veo ningún... Ah, sí. Creo que... Déjame solo. Yes, so I believe we have Eric Sunday. Am I right, Eric? Are you going to... Yes?
Oh, no, I just was clapping.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
So I can see here Ivana Costa, maybe. Yeah, Ivana, gracias.
Gracias, Gabriele. Muchas gracias, Gabriel, por tu excelente conferencia. Solamente te pediría si podés ampliar un poco mejor. Me interesó mucho el análisis muy detallado que hiciste sobre la crítica a la escritura en el Fedro, y sobre la diferencia de que, digamos, a diferencia de los logos, digamos, el maestro que sabe está vivo, ¿no? Vos señalaste hay un pasaje que digamos, esa veracidad consiste en tener en cuenta el alma de quien aprende, ¿no? Digamos, uno podría, en todo caso, establecer protocolos escritos didácticos cada vez más sofisticados y más especiales y más detallados. ¿Eso sería suficiente para Platón? O sea, ¿sería una buena objeción a la crítica?
Sí, hay un problema, efectivamente. Gracias por la pregunta, Ivana, que es un tema muy espinoso. Yo lo he tratado de focalizar desde el ámbito de la neme, pero digamos que si el problema de la escritura fuese un problema solamente técnico, es decir, que no podemos poner todos los argumentos necesarios por escrito, pero es potencialmente factible ponerlos por escrito, pues entonces no podría haber una diferencia o una crítica respecto de su origen. El mito de Teut plantea, mi lectura implica que el mito de Teut es el que plantea como mito que plantea el origen, es etiológico, y por lo tanto establece la característica fundamental. Y la característica fundamental es la escritura es recordatorio, pero el recordatorio destruye la memoria. Ahora, si entendemos memoria como recuerdo de algo específico, pues no funciona el argumento. Porque algo específico puede ponerse por escrito. Un poco a la manera del simposio, ¿no? Hay una conversación entre unos individuos y hay una larga cadena de personas que transmite esa conversación. Y claro, uno podría decir no se recuerda del todo, pero se recuerda lo suficiente, ¿no? Pero a través de discursos orales que se mantienen y que tranquilamente podrían ponerse por escrito. Pero tiene que haber algo más para que haya una diferencia radical entre ambas cosas. Y como la neme aparece en la palidodia, en esta función especial, pienso que la palabra memoria no tiene el sentido cotidiano de simple recuerdo de algo, ¿no? Sino que es, digamos, estar nuevamente ante la presencia de algo. Ahora, uno podría decir, bueno, yo recuerdo al amado, y cuando lo vuelvo a estar en su presencia, pues veo aspectos de él que no he visto antes, o puedo resaltar cosas de él que no he tenido en cuenta antes, ¿no? En el caso de la divinidad hay también formas de ser que uno toma de ella por el recuerdo, pero que puede seguramente seguir tomando cada vez que revisita la divinidad, digamos, a través del contacto erótico. Y creo que lo mismo sucede con el topos hiperuráneos. es un solo complejo de ideas, hay una serie de conexiones, pero cada vez que se está de nuevo en presencia de ella, se resaltan ciertos rasgos que permiten reproducir discursos de enseñanza. Y entonces si uno plantea esa visión de las cosas, ya los escritos o los argumentos didácticos no son suficientes para explicar esa comprensión. Eso es lo que he tratado o por donde creo que va la cosa.
Claro, o sea que, solo una pequeña cosa, Gabriele, o sea que
Sí, sí, tranquila.
Subrayo la presencia, ¿no? El énfasis que hiciste en la presencia, digamos que en la verdadera didáctica, en la verdadera relación maestro-discípulo, digamos, hay una cierta presencia, irreductible a meros mecanismos técnicos. ¿Sería así?
Creo que digamos, si el aprendiz plantea una conexión entre dos nociones, es en función de esa conexión que se puede, ya conociendo su alma también, que son los otros requisitos que he dejado de lado aquí, pero es en función de esas conexiones que uno puede ver dónde hay un error entre ser y apariencia, o sea, digamos, la justicia parece ser tal cosa o parece ser tal otra, y con la base del conocimiento de las ideas, hacer logo y que conduzcan a la comprensión adecuada. Entonces, eso es irreductible a un escrito. Ese era un poco el sentido.
Muy buena, muchas gracias. Realmente muy buena tu análisis de ese pasaje particularmente.
Gracias.
Gracias, Ivana, Gabriel. Creo que nada más preguntas. Entonces, agradezco a Gabriel, Arturo García, and I will give the floor quite immediately to Christoph Poetsch. Christoph is going to talk about two modes of koinonia, triangular read of the Phaedo, the Republic, and the Papyrus of Aï Khanoum. Quite interesting, thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriele, for the kind introduction, and thanks to Raúl and to Gabriele and the whole team for the organization, for the splendid conference so far. And I must say, I'd love to be for the first time in Lima, and I hope we will have the chance one day to not meet this way, but to meet in person, or not at the cave, but in the real world together. So thank you very much. I will now do what everyone does at the very beginning. I will try to share my screen. And let's see how that works. You should now see my screen.
Yes, it is working. Yeah, yes, thank you.
And it is working? Okay. So let me see. Okay, I will start. The talk is called Two Modes of Cornonia, a triangular reading of the Phaedo, the Republic, and the Papyrus of Aï Khanoum. I think the third one of these texts is not so well known, and I will try to introduce that. In two of his middle dialogues, the Phaedo and the Republic, Plato famously uses koinonia within the context of the theory of forms. So let me see. Do you see the next slide now? Okay.
Sí.
Yes, yes.
Okay. In the Phaedo, Socrates famously holds that nothing else makes something beautiful beautiful, but the presence or communion, koinonia, of absolute beauty. Let us call this communion the vertical mode of koinonia, between the particulars and the forms. In the Republic, we just had that in Gabriel, koinonia is employed to describe a relation among the forms themselves when Socrates talks explicitly about the allelon koinonia of the forms. Let us call this communion among the forms the horizontal mode of koinonia. We thus find two modes of koinonia in Plato's middle dialogues, one vertical and one horizontal. And the question, of course, arises how these two modes of koinonia relate to one another. To address this question, I aim to triangulate, in a way, these two dialogues with a third text, the philosophical Papyrus of Icanum. Following a proposal of Margarita Isnardi Parente, the Papyrus 2 uses the word koinonia to discuss the two modes of participation. Including this papyrus might hence provide a very tentative basis for a better understanding of the two modes of koinonia in the Phaedo and the Republic. In the following, I shall first introduce this papyrus and develop several arguments for ascribing the position in it to Plato. In the second part, I will then draw on this premise to then ask how this triangulation might help us in illuminating the two modes of koinonia in the Republic and the Phaedo. So, to begin with the Papyrus of Aï Khanoum. The history of this philosophical papyrus is absolutely fascinating, but I will skip it here for the reasons of time. To those interested in it, I recommend a long paper by Philippe Auvemont on that. And in any case, I must state that I'm deeply indebted to those scholars who have worked on the papyrus before. Besides Auvemont, I have to especially mention mostly French scholars Claude Rapin, Pierre Hadot, Georges Rougemont, Margarita Isnardi Parente, Thomas Auvray, and Fabio Vendruscolo. Their work on the papyrus can be found on the slide, and I can show that later in case anyone is interested. To begin with some data on the papyrus. The papyrus itself was probably written in the first half of the 3rd century BCE, but the work itself most likely originates from the early peripatetic context, probably from Aristotle himself or a first-generation pupil. What we find in it are the fragments of an asymmetrical dialogue between two unknown characters, a principal interlocutor who forwards arguments and a junior partner who in fact only affirms them. The content of this short dialogue is of immense importance because let us jump mid to obvious discussion of some kind of Platonic theory of participation. Since I've said I'm not sure whether everyone is familiar with that text, I will cite only readable columns in their entirety. The following working translation is mine, and it's based on the text of Thomas Auvray from 2019. Since the textual constitution is a matter of discussion, I have marked in red those passages that are based solely on the reconstruction of Auvray and that are not to be found in the more cautious and more conservative edition of Georges Rougemont from 2012. So to begin with the second column, the first column is completely unreadable. So in the second column we read, and of course you jump right into a sentence, because we do not only claim that the sensible particulars participate in the forms, but also that the forms themselves participate in one another. And we see already these are the two modes of koinonia. Yes, we claim that, the interlocutor, the junior partner says. Isn't it therefore the same principle which causes that the forms do not participate in other beings, as well as that the other things participate in these, that is, the forms? There are thus accordingly principles, ideae, and one principle that causes that the other things participate in each single form if the sensible particulars in relation to the, probably the ideas were the forms, but we don't know. So this is the second column. Then we have, of course, some lacunae, and the third column starts again, so that for the same principles, the principle of participation, this will be important, the principle of participation is necessarily unmoved. For every single form is unmoved for these principles, and because the becoming and ceasing of sensible particulars is eternal. That's necessary, he or she, we don't know, says. But doesn't this, that is the principle of participation, seem to be the most supreme and first principle? Yes, exactly. For this is the principle of all things and of all forms. There is reciprocal participation and unfortunately then there comes the next lacuna. And we have a fourth column. It's a bit shorter, and there is a lot of reconstruction there by Thomas Auvray. So this is the most disputable one among the three columns. It is obviously the most inferior if it is, with regard to the hierarchy, something becoming and sensible. So this is talking probably about the particulars, Do you understand that? Yes, completely, he or she said. But what does not participate in any form, that is the first, the proton, and that was in the third column, the first principle. But if it does not participate in the other forms, it is in turn no form. So it seems, he or she said. So this is the text as we have it after the reconstruction of Thomas Auvray. It is not 100% sure whether the two interlocutors use the term koinonia for participation, but I think we have very good reasons to suppose they do so. If we take a look at the first or the second column again, and we take a look at the top, we find that the verb is missing that describes the relation between the forms and the particulars. And since the scribe of the papyrus has this habit of changing nu to gamma before the gutturals kappa and gamma, we know additionally that this verb must begin with a kappa or a gamma. And I think we therefore have quite good reasons that the conjecture of Margarita Isnardi Parente to put koinonia in there is very reasonable, because it fits there from the length and it has to do something with participation, and it starts with a kappa or a gamma. And I think Isnardi Parente is very reasonably right to conjecture that koinonia fits in there. The more controversial question is, of course, whether the discussion is about Plato's own theory of participation or the position of some first-generation Platonists. Of course, one cannot reach certainty here, and thus we have to remain cautious, of course. Nevertheless, I think that there are several arguments in favor of tentatively ascribing the position to Plato in the papyrus. My first argument is that I think that in some way in the fragment, we can find a twofold allusion to Plato's allegory in the cave, because when explaining the allegory, Socrates tells to Glaucon that in the region of the known, the last thing to be seen and hardly seen is the idea of the good, and that when it seen it, one has to conclude that this is indeed the principle of all things, of all that is right and beautiful, giving birth in the visible world to light and the curios of light, and itself in the intelligible world being the curia of truth and reason. This is the translation by Shori, a bit modified, and of course I left curios and curia in Greek. I think that the papyrus alludes to this passage in two ways. The first allusion is to be found in the superlative kuriotaton, or with a gamma, because we have again a guttural after it. In being a superlative, it presupposes some other kurios or other kurioi in order to be the highest and most powerful lord, so to speak, of all. We find a very similar constellation in the passage of the Republic that I just quoted, where the idea to agatu is a curia who has another kurios underneath her. She is not explicitly he kuriotate in the Republic, but the description of the two kurioi in a kind of hierarchy in the Republic, in fact, expresses a very similar thought. The second allusion, to some lesser degree, is in my eyes the doubling of the word pas, all, that is found in the very same passage of the Republic that I just quoted, when Socrates says that the idea of the good is pasi panton orton tekai kalon aitia. Not in the same, but in a similar sense, we find this double pas in the papyrus, where the interlocutor says directly after the kuriotaton that the highest principle is aition pasi kai pasais tais ideais. Of course, this concept of a principle of everything is in turn found in the very same passage of the Republic, when Socrates calls the idea of the and not only find the very concept of principle of everything that stands above the particulars and the forms in both texts, but we find this expressed in the papyrus in terms that are at least similar to the way in which Plato expresses this thought in the Republic. I'm sorry if we have connection problems. I just got told it. Please, Gabriel, I see you. Please wave your hand if it's not working.
No, yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it didn't work for a minute, for a second, actually. I think you can go.
Okay. So
Thank
just
you.
write me or try to take my note. Thank you. Okay. My second argument for tentatively ascribing it to Plato is that we have to remember that the papyrus as a dialogue is obviously a published work and no lecture script or something from the inside of the peripatetic school. And in a published work, an allusion to a very prominent text, like the Cave of the Republic doubtlessly is and was already in antiquity, seems quite plausible to me. There is probably, I would think, no better candidate than the three similes of the Republic if one wants to allude to Plato. If we keep that in mind, I think we find further explanation why there is precisely an allusion to this very famous text of the Republic. A third argument could be done with that term, totes metexios aition, and the way how Aristotle in Metaphysics Eta 6 criticizes this term, because this is one of the very few occurrences of this term in the Greek corpus that we have. But I shall skip this third argument for the sake of brevity. So, to come to the second part and the two modes of koinonia. So this was only preparatory so far. If we draw on the premise that the position in the papyrus is in fact Plato, we can now ask how the papyrus might help us in understanding the two modes, the vertical and the horizontal one, of koinonia that we found in the Republic and in the Phaedo. The argument of the papyrus is of course fragmentary, but I think one can extract some very basic claims from it about participation. The first one is that we can clearly find three levels, so to speak, in its systematic account. There are the sensible particulars, ta aisteta, the forms, ta idei, and the supreme principle, which is obviously superior to the forms. This becomes especially clear if one follows Offre's reconstruction of the fourth column that I quoted, where the particulars are said to occupy the lowest rank, while the proton, that is the supreme principle according to the third column, is itself excluded even from the forms. But also within the certain lines of the third column, this tripartite structure becomes quite evident when it is said that the supreme principle grounds both the sensible particulars and forms, and is obviously in some sense at least superior to them. Secondly, we clearly find both the horizontal and the vertical mode of koinonia within the papyrus. This is found both in the reconstruction of the second column, I said that in the beginning, and in Offre's reconstruction at the end of the third column, which is in my eyes highly plausible. So we have the vertical and the horizontal mode of koinonia both discussed there. And thirdly, it is interesting to see that the whole argument of the papyrus seems to circle around in some way around the idea that these two modes of koinonia are ultimately grounded in one and the same supreme principle, which is called totes metexios aition. And this is obviously the principle of vertical participation, which is confirmed in the second column when it is said that the supreme principle causes the participation of the particulars in the forms. And the end of the column 3 makes it highly likely that the horizontal mode, that means among the forms of koinonia, is as well grounded in the very same supreme principle. Within the papyrus, the two modes of koinonia are thus ultimately two species of the same kind, one could say, without denying that there are differences. Let us now return with these results to the Republic and the Phaedo. For the Republic, I think, there can be little doubt that the koinonia of the forms has a strong ethical and political aspect. One only has to think of the famous passage Republic 500b, we had that in Gabriel's talk just minutes before, where Socrates describes the relations among the forms as something that sounds very like the perfectly just polis, where none of the forms neither does nor suffers any injustice to or from other forms. And I will take a step back from that because Raul Gutierrez is a much better expert on that topic, and he really rightly emphasized that importance and the complexity of this passage and the importance of the koinonia of the forms in connection with the political thing in his book El Arte de la Conversación. And when at the end of book 9, Socrates refers to the famous paradigm in heaven, an urano paradigma, to which the future rulers should liken their perfect polis to, this again, of course, points to the very same direction of political implications of the koinonia of forms. The koinonia of the forms is thus the most perfect communion, so to speak, which in turn prefigures the pursued unity in the just polis. Given the proposed triangulation, we need to ask now how the horizontal mode of koinonia within the Republic might relate to the information about the horizontal mode in the papyrus. Within the papyrus, it was the supreme principle that ultimately governed and caused the horizontal communion among the forms. Within the Republic, I think there can be no doubt that the most prominent candidate for such a first and highest principle is the idea to agatou. However, Socrates nowhere in the Republic explicitly states that the idea to agatou is the basis for the perfect communion of the forms. But there is a chance that the way how the papyrus deals with the horizontal mode of koinonia and its foundation in the first principle may actually fit to that way how the Republic does with that. And I think that's the case, and my argument for that runs as follows. First of all, we need to remember that the forms depend for their essence and their existence in the idea to agatou, as Socrates said explicitly in the analogy of the sun, 509b. Secondly, as mentioned earlier, the entirety of the forms is a paradigm to the perfect polis. And I think we may infer that this unity of the form is somehow related to their koinonia of the forms. We have the word allelon both in 500c and in 476a. Thirdly, Socrates says explicitly that in forming and governing the perfect polis, the ruler does not only rely on the forms, but necessarily takes into account the idea to agatou as well. This is most clearly stated in the Cave when he says that one has to look at the idea of the good in order to act wisely in private and in political issues. That's 517c. And before that, he had already emphasized that to megiston agaton of the polis consists in its unity, harmony, and cohesion, and that this unity is something he calls totu agatou ichnos. So the unity in the political realm is a kind of trace of the megiston agaton, of the agaton. Because there is no greater good, he says, than that which binds together and makes one. Synde tekai poie mian. We have thus the dependence of the forms in their totality on the idea of the good on the one hand, and on the other hand, the necessity of the forms and the idea to agatou for the philosopher kings and queens to form the unity of the polis. But since it is, of course, not the philosophers who actually establish and cause the koinonia among the forms themselves, I think that we can infer that it is likewise the idea of the good that ultimately constitutes the forms. The principle cause order the cohesion of the forms. But this is in fact the very same constellation that we found in the papyrus. Of course, this remains only an outline, and we cannot infer from all this in which way this foundation of koinonia ultimately works in detail. For this, we are more or less in the dark, so to speak. But the basic constellation, nevertheless, remains the same, and we may thus state at this point that what we find about the horizontal mode of koinonia, both in the Republic and the Papyrus, is in general accordance. The evidence is somewhat a bit dimmer if we turn to the Phaedo. within the triangulation, one has to ask how the Phaedo's vertical mode now of koinonia relates to the way in which the papyrus deals with it. That means to ask whether we can find some equivalent to the supreme principle in the papyrus also within the Phaedo in its account of the vertical koinonia. I think that one can find this in the Phaedo, though this is of course not the most prominent aspect in Socrates' explanation of the forms. To uncover this, one has to take into account two things in my eyes. Firstly, the best, to beltiston, and the good, to which Socrates alludes as an idea in his criticism of Anaxagoras. And secondly, how this is connected to the theory of forms by the way in which the hypotheses of each single form can be supported by some higher principle. There can be little doubt in my eyes that in his criticism of what is missing in Anaxagoras, Plato lets his Socrates reveal quite a lot of what he's actually looking for. In his criticism, Socrates several times points to something that he calls to beltiston, which forms the true idea. This has to be something else than some material cause or principle, he says, and in a certain sense it is true that each single form is little later this kind of new idea that Socrates was looking for and that Anaxagoras did disappointingly not provide. However, if one looks carefully at the text, one can get the impression that there is indeed one single idea to be found, and in an interesting parallel to the Republic, this is again called the good. We find two instances of this. The first one is to be found in Socrates' criticism that he misses to koinon pasin agaton in Anaxagoras, which is in fact the idea that Socrates is looking for, as he says. This is not only interesting for the reason that this obviously names one common good for everything, pasin, but also alludes, of course, to koinonia by the adjective koinon. The second instance is to be found shortly afterwards, when Socrates criticizes some cosmological accounts of his predecessors for looking for the wrong kind of idea, that is, for a purely material principle. According to Socrates, they are missing that the good and binding binds and holds together, to agaton kai deon, syndein kai syn echein. On the one hand, this makes clear that the agaton in this account is not limited to something ethical or human, but also embraces cosmological and thus ontological aspects, however this may work in the end, but it is clear from the context. And on the other hand, it is quite interesting that this to agaton kai deon is responsible for some kind of syndesmos, and I will come to this in a second. In the very next step, famously, Socrates then introduces the theory of forms, while explicitly stating that this new kind of idea is in accordance with what he just had said before. Within his explanation of the theory of forms, Socrates elaborates how one can further confirm the hypothesis of a single eidos by going upwards until one reaches something he calls ti hikanon, something sufficient. This ti hikanon is archaic. The single is success. It is in fact one and the same ti hikanon for all hypotheses of single forms. However, Socrates does not explicitly state that this arche, this ti hikanon, is what he had called for before the agaton and the koinon pasin agaton. But I think that this lies at least at hand, and one can therefore find at least traces of such a supreme principle within the Phaedo. There is further support to this, I think, and even more if we compare the Phaedo Republic in that respect, but I can't follow these traces here. But how might that relate to the vertical mode of koinonia within the present triangulation? In fact, Socrates uses several terms, as we know, for the vertical mode of participation in the Phaedo, but he actually never attempts for any deeper explanation of how this works in detail. The only trace of an explanation I can find in the text might be found in the statement quoted before, according to which the agaton actually is the principle of a syndesmos, which, that is unambiguous from the context, has ontological and cosmological relevance. That Socrates is looking for has to be something immaterial. We have probably a syndesmos between material and immaterial things here. If one thinks, for instance, of the desmos and the timaeos, this might indeed allude, at least, to the bond and the relation between the forms and the particulars. If this is true, the Phaedo would then indeed state in 99c 5-6 something that is remarkably similar to the way in which the papyrus deals with the vertical mode of koinonia. In both cases, it would then be in fact one supreme principle that is somehow responsible for the vertical mode of koinonia. As I said, when turning to the Phaedo, the evidence is somewhat dimmer than between the Republic and the Papyrus, but there is, however, a possibility, and likewise I see at first glance no greater obstacle, to see some parallel of how the Papyrus posits a first principle as totes metexios aition, and how the Phaedo alludes to the agathon as an idea of a vertical ontological syndesmos. If we sum up the proposed triangulation, we might tentatively, very tentatively, ask whether the two modes of koinonia that we find in the Phaedo and in the Republic are not in some sense two species of the same kind. Because in a sense, the Papyrus gives a hint to regard both modes of koinonia as being ultimately grounded in one supreme principle that we find clearly in the Republic and somewhat dimmer in the Phaedo. The cohesion and unity among the forms, as well as the cohesion and relation between the particulars and the forms, would thus be caused by this one single supreme principle. I'm well aware, and this is of course only a sketch because there's much more to be done on the Papyrus especially. I'm well aware that my argument includes several variables, among them, of course, the uncertainty that we have, and which is intrinsic to the fragmentary text status like that we have in the Papyrus. However, I think that the bigger picture one can get from this triangulation that I've sketched here is a remarkably coherent one. It is coherent in the sense that actually little to nothing actively prevents from regarding the two modes of koinonia in the Republic and the Phaedo as ultimately two species of the same kind. This is, of course, not to deny that there must be specific differences to these two modes of koinonia, but ultimately there might be a common ground or something to both of them. And that, I have no doubts, would be perfectly in the sense of koinonia. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope the technical problems were not too big during the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. I believe we could follow you beside a few seconds. I think it's very clear. So let me check if someone raise a hand. I can't see any question by now. If someone would like to jump in, Ivana. Okay, thank you, Ivana. Sorry, Ivana, please, yes.
Okay,
Yes,
now I can. Thank you very much, Christoph, for your great exposition. I just wanted, I found it quite stimulating. I think there is one thing, two brief things, maybe you surely you had them in mind. First of all, the references to the cave or to other Platonic dialogues, this also Margherita Isnardi Parenti also said is a common feature of the Apocrypha. I mean, of the Apocrypha to make them sure to be Platonic, they make references to other dialogues. That was the bad part of the question. The good part of my question was, did you think about the consequences, the philosophical consequences it has for Plato, that there is one principle that makes koinonia allelon, I mean, of all the forms between them, among them. Because I'm quite sure that your approach to the similarities and the koinonia between Republic and Phaedo is quite good. It's quite but maybe Plato is not thinking, or it's not Platonic, the thought that there is one principle that regulates any kind of koinonia among all the forms. That was my question.
Okay, thank you very much. Your first question actually gives me the chance to clarify something if I was unclear on that. I wanted to, of course, the allusion to the cave was not to say that this is maybe a lost dialogue of Plato. No, Plato is for sure not the dialogue. And I think it's not a dialogue that wants to, it's not a dialogue that pretends to be a Platonic dialogue. I think that Thomas of Ré had made good arguments that it is from Periphilosophia of Aristotle, from the second book. So I think it's an Aristotelian dialogue. And this is not to be pretending to be Platonic, but I think if Aristotle, or a first generation pupil of Aristotle, wants to allude to Plato, the text of the cave is a perfect thing to allude to, but not to fake to be Platonic. I'm sorry if I was unclear on that. I wanted to leave.
Maybe I didn't understand. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, I left out the question of authorship because this is again very complicated. The question is the philosophical consequences if we have the koinonia grounded in one supreme principle. Of course, the most difficult question is how should that work and how does this work? And as I said, we get not that much from the text. I think that one aspect would be that it is like a kind of attractive cause again, and that might even relate to the discussion in Periphilosophia again, but that's a different topic. I think that it is quite Platonic that we have one principle of all, because we have that arche tu pantos and toropontina panton aitia quite literally in the text a few times, and he says that the curia, the idea to agatu, did more or less everything, and she engendered the other curios and so on. I think that's quite Platonic. But I think we still have to keep in mind, if we think of the koinonia of the forms in the Republic and also later in the Sophists, it's not a simple koinonia that everything is connected with everything. That is not the point, I think. But I think it's a more complex structured idea, and I think it's difficult to get that from the dialogues. I mean, we have in De Anima of Aristotle, we have that point again from Periphilosophia, interestingly, where he says that this autos so on is some kind of mathematical structure. If that is true, that might help, but again, it's quite difficult. I think only from the text of the dialogues, it's difficult to understand how that in detail should work. But I think it's Platonic to have this one supreme principle. I think that's quite clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. So the next in line will be on my list here, Travis Butler, then Edward Halper, and at the end, Roberto Granieri. Thank you, Travis.
Yeah, I think this is maybe a little bit of a cheap question, but I was wondering, how much does the papyrus really add to what we already get in the Republic? If you sort of take seriously the idea that the good is the cause of everything, and of everything, and the goodness of everything good, then it seems like maybe a lot of what you're getting from the papyrus is already going to follow from the Republic. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about what specifically we get from the papyrus that isn't already in the Republic.
Yes, thank you. I think one thing we can get, I mean, of course we have some discussion of participation in some sense in the Republic, but we have, I think, rather little about the relation of the first principle of the good to that relation. We have the thing that I just quoted in the cave, that it is somehow the cause of the forms. also an analogy of the sun. It is the cause tropontina also of the sensible things, but it does not. This does not imply immediately that it is also responsible for the relation between those two, for the relation of metaxes, so to speak. And that is, I think, one thing we can get from this, from if we take the papyrus into that constellation. And of course, one can also think, if we have a second source in that sense, if it is true, I mean, we don't know that, if it is at the dialogue of Aristotle, and if it is from the second book of Periphilosophia, we have some external quotation on that relation. And I think it also helps to get together these two relations, as I try to sketch, at least from the Phaedo and from the Republic. And I think it, in the end, it's something different to say, okay, it only causes those different things, the forms and the sensibles, but it also causes the relation between them. How this works is a different story, but I think that is something we can get if we take the papyrus trip to it. Thank you.
Good, thanks.
Thank you both again. Edward, please.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a very interesting paper. I have a couple of questions. First, an observation that the structure you find in the papyrus and implicitly the Phaedo and the Republic is something parallel to what we find Aristotle describing the Platonists as having in Metaphysics Alpha 6 and 7. Except not the good, but the one is the first principle, and the forms are the essences of the sensibles, and the one is the essence of the forms. So it's very much the same structure, and but it's obviously different because it's the one and not the good. And there's always a question about how accurate he is. The second, the question that goes along with that is, you mentioned Alpha 8 to 6, and he does mention, Aristotle does mention this problem there about the cause of the participation. But what he says is, what he's interested in is, well, why is there a round sphere? Well, how come the form is united with the matter? And he says, well, some people say there's a cause of this participation. But then they're in aporia when to explain what it is. So he doesn't think that it's actually they're actually able to explain it. So that seems to me to count against your account here, that this is somehow they're not able to explain this. And so that's the first thing I want to ask about. And the second thing I want to ask about is just how you understand the unity of this, of the two kinds of koinonia. Why is it that a form that is the one or a good would cause all the forms to somehow commune with each other? And why is it that communing with each other would somehow be the participation of the sensibles into forms? So I have I have a suggestion about that, about what they might have been thinking about, but I'd like to hear how you understand it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I just got the sun in here, which fits perfectly to the analogy of the sun. Thank you very much for the questions.
Well, that's a sort of divine confirmation of what you're saying here.
No.
If you will need so, yeah.
I hope I don't need. Thank you for the questions. I actually had a paragraph in the paper for the question of how Eta 6 and Metaphysics Alpha 6 and 7 and also A9 relate to one another, because there again we have this criticism of they talk about metaxes, but they actually do not really explain this koinōnia, and they don't really know what this is. The one point is the question. I think that that's a greater issue. We cannot solve this here completely. The question is Aristotle always very fair with his criticism, or is he sometimes a bit more, so to speak? I don't know how to say that in English. In Germany, we say you let fall it under the table in a certain sense, and I think that relates to the second part of the question of how this what's the core concept between the two modes, what is the uniting core, and in a sense it's the concept of unity, I would say. And as I said in the response to Ivana Costa, as I have the impression that this is somehow done by some kind of attractivity of the good, or also the beautiful, the good and the beautiful, if we think of how the good and the beautiful are aligned to one another in the symposium or in the lysis. And this is, of course, quite close to what Aristotle considers his main contribution to the history of philosophy, to have this telos, the idea that works as a final cause. And I have somehow the impression that it would work in pretty much a similar way to explain how the koinonia, the unity of those two relate, or what's the common conceptual core to those both modes. And actually Tomao Frey made some arguments in his 2019 paper and explaining how he located that part of the papyrus at the end of the second book, and how the third book of Periphilosophia then talks again about exactly that question. And I think that would hint to the question of how these two modes actually work together. And just one more remark, as he said, then, that we have the not the good but the one in A6 and A7. I mean, we have at least that what I quoted 462 BC from the Republic, where he says that it is binding it and making it one, and that this is the megiston agaton for the polis, and this is actually an ichnos of the good. And I think if making it one is an ichnos of the good, it is not that far to think that the one and the good have something to do with one another. But thank you very much for the comments, and I would be very curious about your idea, Edward, how to solve the issue.
I don't know if I have time to say it here. I can say it shortly, but I don't want to take. We're running out of time, or.
Yes, of course we are. Yes, as always. Thank you, Edward.
Thank you.
But you are the president. You can do whatever you want. We are platonic on this, if you want to comment on this. Okay, thank you. So last question.
Maybe we can do this via email. I would be very interested. Maybe I can write you an email, Edward.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So we have a last question. We are really out of time, but we had a special allowance from Raul to spend some more minutes. So Roberto Granieri, please, last question.
I can drop my question if you're really out of time. So
no, please, okay. Go on.
Okay. So thanks for the paper. I wanted to ask a question about actually the main thesis you want, the main point you want to make in your talk, namely about how these two modes of koinonia are related to one another, and whether they actually two or one. And if I got it correctly, the point you're making is that they are aspects of a single mode of koinonia, in that they are both grounded in a first principle of all, and therefore they can be reduced to the concept of unity. Am I correct in that?
I would not do it that strong, reduced to unity, but have this common conceptual core, so to speak.
Okay. So here's my question. Do you think that this single mode of koinonia is a primitive notion, or do you think it can be analyzed in more basic, more elementary notions? So, for example, if one asked what the single mode of koinonia actually, how this single mode of koinonia can, how can it be metaphysically explained? Would you say that it's just primitive, and therefore we must accept that it is just a basic relationship between two items, or can it be can it be analyzed and analyzed further?
Thank you very much for the question. Of course, one can give a very long answer. I don't think that it would be very simple. And as I try to stress at the very beginning, there are also specific differences, of course, to it, and one has to elaborate these. But it goes a bit back to the question of Ivana at the beginning. Of course, it's not just a simple say, okay, it's just gluing everything together, and that's pretty much the thing. If you glue forms together, or whether you, I don't know, glue sensibles and particulars together, it's just gluing together and that's it. I think that's not. I think, for instance, for the vertical mode of what I call the vertical mode of koinonia, at least in the later time with the Timaeus, somehow the question of the soul must be implemented there, or must have been a part of that questions, for instance. And of course, we have this question whether the pantelos on has a psyche as well in the sophist. But I think that would be one instance how to deal with that. And as I said also to Ivana, it's of course not just everything stands in relation to everything, because we have this much more differentiated view in the sophist, for instance. And I think that would be then the questions to elaborate these single aspects. I don't know if that answers, but at least as a sketch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, you all, Ryan, Christoph, and Gabriel, for this very wonderful section. I believe we should skip to the next session. I believe.
Maybe.
Like to... Oh, Raul, yes, please. Thank you.
10 minutes pause.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Yes, and we start at 11:30.
Yes, of course. It is up to you, and Renato. I think my colleague and friend Renato will be join us as a chair. Thank you all.
Gracias, Gabriele.
Yes, thank you.
A ti.